So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Is that a knockoff? Bianca Vance sneered, fingering Elena Vance's collar in front of the dozen dinner guests gathered on Aunt Sylvia's moonlit terrace. The conversation died instantly, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the soft clinking of silver against china. Bianca didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she pinched the fabric of the navy shift dress with a look of theatrical disgust, ensuring everyone at the long, linen-draped table saw her disdain. Elena didn't flinch. She remained perfectly still, her fingers curled around the stem of a water glass. The cold condensation seeped into her skin, a sharp contrast to the humid evening air that smelled heavily of blooming jasmine and Bianca's cloying, overexpensive perfume. "It's just a dress, Bianca," Elena said, her voice level. "It's an eyesore," Bianca countered, turning to the guests with a practiced, influencer-grade pout. She adjusted her own dress, a shimmering rose-gold piece that cost more than most people's cars, and leaned into Marcus Stone, who sat beside her. He chuckled, his hand sliding possessively around Bianca's waist. "I'm just saying, Elena, if you're going to show up to Aunt Sylvia's estate, you should at least try to look like you belong in the family. You look like the help." A few of the guests, social climbers eager to stay in Bianca's good graces, let out stifled laughs. Aunt Sylvia, seated at the head of the table, narrowed her eyes but remained silent, her gaze darting between her two nieces. "Now, Bianca, don't be cruel," Margaret Vance said, though there was no sting in her rebuke. She sat next to Arthur Vance, both of them beaming at their successful daughter while barely glancing at the other. "Your sister has a very demanding little job in tech. She doesn't have time for the finer things like you do." "Demanding?" Arthur snorted, swirling a deep red Cabernet in his glass. The scent of the expensive vintage wafted toward Elena, oaky and bitter. "She's a glorified cubicle monkey. If she put half the effort into her appearance that she does into those spreadsheets, she might actually find a husband who could provide for her." The injustice of it burned in Elena's throat like swallowed ash. They had no idea. They saw the quiet girl who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 5-year-old sedan. They didn't see the woman who had spent the last 7 years building a venture capital empire under a pseudonym. They didn't know that the spreadsheets Arthur mocked were actually the blueprints for a $450 million acquisition that would be finalized in less than 72 hours. "I'm comfortable, Father," Elena said, taking a slow sip of her water. "Comfortable is a word for people who have given up," Bianca snapped. She reached across the table, her manicured nails clicking against the mahogany as she snatched Elena's bread plate to make room for her own oversized designer clutch. "Speaking of being comfortable, I had to use your social security number for that boutique line of credit today. My primary accounts are tied up in the new Maldives campaign, and the bank was being so tedious about a bridge loan." Elena's hand tightened on her glass. The silence that followed was heavy. "You did what?" "Oh, don't get your pearls in a twist," Bianca said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's not like you're using your credit for anything important. You're practically a ghost in the financial system anyway. I'm doing you a favor by actually putting some activity on your file." "Bianca, that's identity theft," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "It's family," Arthur interrupted, his voice booming with authority. "Don't be dramatic, Elena. Your sister is a brand. She has appearances to maintain. If she needs a little help with her cash flow while she's waiting for her next big contract, you should be honored to help. It's the least you can do, considering how much she does for our family's reputation." Margaret nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Bianca is the face of the Vance family. You're just the background." Elena looked around the table. Marcus Stone was smirking, his eyes scanning Elena with a mixture of boredom and contempt. Her parents were looking at her as if she were a broken appliance, and Bianca was already back to taking a selfie, the flash of her phone momentarily blinding Elena. Under the table, Elena's smartwatch gave a discreet, rhythmic haptic buzz. She glanced down. A message from Julian Thorne, her lead counsel, flashed on the tiny screen. "The final audit of Bianca Vance's influencer holdings is complete. It's a house of cards, Elena. She's over-leveraged by millions, and she's been using your name to sign for the leases on her luxury cars and her penthouse. Give the word, and we pull the rug." Elena felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. The rage didn't disappear. It simply crystallized into a sharp, lethal edge. She looked at Bianca, who was currently pouting for the camera, oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a precipice. "You're right, father," Elena said, her voice so quiet the table had to lean in to hear her. "I am the background. I've spent a long time making sure everyone stays in their proper place." "See," Bianca chirped, not even looking up from her phone. "She gets it. Now be a dear and pass the butter. This bread is the only thing at this table that isn't boring." Elena passed the butter. Her movements were fluid, her face a mask of perfect, sisterly compliance. But as she sat back, she felt the weight of the secret she carried. She wasn't the background anymore. She was the architect. "I think I'll head out early," Elena said, standing up. "I have a very big day on Monday. A lot of things are shifting." "Whatever," Bianca muttered, already deep in a conversation with Marcus about a yacht party she couldn't afford. Arthur and Margaret didn't even look up as Elena walked away from the table. Only Aunt Sylvia watched her go, her sharp eyes lingering on the way Elena carried herself, shoulders back, head high, like a queen departing a slum. As Elena reached her car, she pulled out her phone and hit a speed dial. Julian Thorne answered on the first ring. "Julian," Elena said, her voice echoing in the quiet driveway. "Change the plan for the acquisition announcement on Wednesday. I don't want it done in a press release." "What are you thinking, Elena?" Julian asked. Elena looked back at the glowing terrace, where the sounds of her family's laughter drifted through the trees. "Aunt Sylvia is hosting the Vance Family Legacy Gala on Friday. Every investor, every socialite, and every creditor in the city will be there." And, Elena said, a predatory smile finally touching her lips, "I want to make sure my sister gets exactly the kind of attention she's been working so hard for." The next morning, the air in Elena's private office smelled of rain and expensive espresso. Julian Thorne sat across from her, sliding a thick leather folder across the mahogany desk. He looked every bit the corporate shark she'd hired, his eyes sharp behind rimless glasses as he watched her. "The audit is complete," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Your sister didn't just skim, Elena. She's been using your social security number to secure high-interest loans for her lifestyle brand. She's currently $3 million in the hole to a holding company I recently acquired on your behalf." Elena Vance felt a cold, sharp satisfaction bloom in her chest. She didn't just own a piece of her sister's debt. She held the leash to her entire existence. She traced the embossed logo on the folder, the pebble-grained leather cool under her fingertips. "And the gala?" she asked. "The paperwork is finalized. By Friday night, the creditors will move in. Publicly," Julian confirmed. "But there's more. Your parents have been co-signing these documents, using the family estate as collateral. They think they're investing in a mogul. They don't realize they're funding a black hole." "Let them keep believing it for 4 more days," she replied. 2 hours later, Elena returned to the Vance estate to retrieve the last of her personal files. The foyer was a battlefield of shopping bags and discarded tissue paper. Bianca stood in the center of the marble hall, draped in a coat of silver fox fur that shimmered under the chandelier. The scent of her cloying, floral perfume was thick enough to choke the air. "Oh, look who crawled back," Bianca sneered, checking her reflection in the gilded mirror. She didn't even turn around, her attention fixed on her own image. "Did your little coding project crash? You look exhausted, Elena. Maybe if you spent less time behind a screen and more time on your skin routine, you wouldn't look so provincial." Margaret Vance stepped out of the dining room, her smile tight and directed entirely at her younger daughter. "Now, Bianca, be nice." "Elena, dear, while you're here, your father and I were looking at the books. There's a small discrepancy in the family trust, just a few $100,000. Since you're so good with numbers, we've decided you should take responsibility for the filing error. It'll save Bianca's reputation before the gala." The audacity was a physical weight in the room. They weren't just asking for help, they were demanding she become a martyr for a thief. Elena watched her mother, seeing the woman's total lack of shame. "A filing error," Elena repeated, her voice level betraying nothing of the fire rising in her gut. "It's for the family, Elena," Arthur Vance added, descending the stairs with a glass of scotch in hand. The smell of peat and entitlement preceded him. He didn't look at her, only at the amber liquid in his glass. "Bianca is the face of this family. You're just the backbone, and the backbone stays hidden." Bianca laughed, a high, brittle sound that grated like glass on stone. She reached out, flicking the collar of Elena's simple cotton blazer with a manicured nail. "Don't worry, sis. I'll make sure you get a seat in the back at Sylvia's gala, somewhere near the kitchen where you belong. You can watch me announce the new partnership that's going to make us billionaires." Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and touched the edge of a sleek, obsidian-colored card, the kind issued only to the top 0.1% of Julian's clients. She didn't pull it out. She just felt its weight, a silent, heavy promise of what was to come. "Friday," Elena said, her gaze shifting between her parents and the sister who had hollowed out her life for years. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I think everyone is going to see exactly who belongs where." "That's the spirit," her father muttered, finally looking up. "Glad to see you've found your place." Elena turned and walked out, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble like the steady ticking of a bomb. She had 4 days. 4 days until the Vance family legacy became a cautionary tale, and she was the only one who knew the ending. As she reached her car, she checked her watch. The countdown wasn't just in her head anymore, it was on the clock. 2 days later, the air in the city felt heavy with the scent of rain and ozone, a storm brewing just beyond the glass and steel skyline. Elena Vance stood in the elevator of the Thorne building, watching the floor numbers climb with a rhythmic, mechanical hum. When the doors slid open, she was met with the sterile, intimidating elegance of Julian Thorne's private floor. The lobby smelled of expensive espresso and the faint, metallic tang of high-end air filtration. Julian Thorne sat behind a desk of polished mahogany that looked like a slab of dark glass. He didn't rise when she entered, but his sharp, predatory eyes tracked her every move. He was a man who dealt in corporate executions, and today he looked particularly hungry. "The digital trail is complete," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He slid a sleek tablet across the desk. "It's more than just identity theft, Elena. Bianca Vance didn't just borrow your credit score to buy her followers. She's been rerouting the dividends from the Vance Mercer Trust into a shell company for 18 months. She forged your signature on 3 separate loan applications." Elena leaned forward, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the screen. She scrolled through the documents, the jagged, hurried attempts to mimic her handwriting, the timestamps that matched the days Bianca had claimed to be mentoring her. Every swipe of the finger revealed a new layer of betrayal. It was a systematic hollowing out of her life, performed by her own sister while her parents looked on and applauded the success of their favorite daughter. "And the obsidian card?" Elena asked, her voice steady. Julian smirked, a thin, dangerous line. "Active. I've linked it to the primary holdings. As of 3 minutes ago, you have the liquidity to buy the very boutique Bianca is currently standing in, which, according to her social media geolocator, is exactly where she is right now." Elena felt a surge of cold, quiet power. It wasn't the heat of anger, but the chill of absolute certainty. "Keep the filings ready, Julian. I want the injunction served the moment the toast begins on Friday." "It's your funeral," Julian said, though his eyes sparkled with professional admiration. "Or theirs." Elena left the office and drove toward the Diamond District. She found her sister exactly where Julian said she would be, Elettle, an invitation-only boutique where the champagne was free and the price tags were hidden. The chime of the boutique door was melodic and soft. The shop smelled of lilies and white musk. Bianca Vance was standing on a velvet pedestal in the center of the room, draped in a gown of shimmering, midnight blue silk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. 2 stylists hovered at her feet like devotees at an altar. "It's a bit tight in the waist," Bianca complained, checking her reflection in the triptych mirror. She didn't see Elena at first. "But I suppose I can just skip lunch for a few days." Marcus Stone is bringing his father to Sylvia's gala, and I need to look like I've never seen a carb in my life. The color is perfect for your skin tone, Miss Vance, one stylist whispered. Of course it is, Bianca snapped. She finally caught Elena's reflection in the mirror. Her expression shifted from vanity to immediate, sharp-edged contempt. Oh, look what the cat dragged in. Elena, what are you doing here? This place doesn't even have a clearance rack for whatever it is you're wearing. The stylist shared a quick, judgmental look. Elena didn't flinch. She walked deeper into the store, her heels silent on the thick cream carpet. I heard you were preparing for Friday. I thought I'd see if you needed any help. Bianca laughed, a high, brittle sound that set Elena's teeth on edge. Help? From you? Your lucky Aunt Sylvia felt sorry enough for you to let you through the door. Actually, now that you're here, hold this. Bianca thrust her designer handbag toward Elena as if she were a common servant. And go find me those silver pumps in a 7. The girl who works here is too slow. One of the stylists stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Actually, I can. No, Bianca interrupted, her eyes locked on Elena S. My sister needs to learn her place before the gala. She's going to be my assistant for the evening. It'll explain why she's there without a date or a decent dress. It'll save the family the embarrassment of people wondering why the smart one looks like a librarian on a budget. Elena took the bag. She felt the weight of it, the expensive leather, the gold hardware, all paid for with money Bianca had stolen from her. She didn't throw it. She didn't scream. She simply looked at her sister with a calm that should have been terrifying. You want me to be there to help you, Bianca? Elena asked softly. I want you to be there so everyone can see the difference between us, Bianca sneered, turning back to the mirror to admire her stolen finery. One of us is the face of the Vance legacy. The other is just the shadow. Don't forget that. I won't, Elena said. She reached into her own pocket and felt the sharp edge of the obsidian card. I'm going to make sure Friday is a night no one ever forgets. Bianca waved her off with a dismissive hand. Whatever, just get the shoes. And make sure they're polished. I have a reputation to maintain. Elena turned and walked toward the back of the store. She didn't look for shoes. She found the manager's office, tucked behind a screen of frosted glass. She didn't say a word as she laid the obsidian card on the desk. The manager's eyes went wide, his posture shifting from professional indifference to frantic, stuttering subservience in a heartbeat. I want that blue dress, Elena whispered, her voice like a razor. And I want it removed from the floor immediately. If she asks, tell her there was a clerical error with her credit line. The manager nodded so hard he nearly tripped. Of course, ma'am, right away. Elena walked back out into the main room just as Bianca was demanding to know where the shoes were. Elena didn't answer. She simply dropped the handbag on a chair and headed for the exit. Where are you going? Bianca shouted after her. I'm not done with you. Elena paused at the door, the bell chiming above her head. She looked back over her shoulder, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. 48 hours, Bianca. Enjoy the dress while you can. As she stepped out into the rain, the countdown in her mind hit a new, frantic tempo. The evidence was secured. The ally was ready. The trap was set. All that was left was the wait. The following afternoon, the air in Julian Thorne's office was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the sharp, metallic tang of a high-end laser printer. Julian slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk, his movements precise and clinical. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, met Elena S. It's all here, Elena Vance, he said, his voice a low, rhythmic hum that commanded attention. The wire transfers, the forged signatures, and the trail of shell companies Bianca Vance used to drain your trust fund. Once I file this, there is no legal shield in the world that can protect her. Elena touched the cool, embossed seal on the top document. She didn't need to look inside. She had lived through every cent of the theft. The paper felt heavy, a physical manifestation of the justice she had been denied for years. Good, she replied, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor that used to plague her in this office. I want the filing timed exactly with the start of Aunt Sylvia's gala. I want the notification to hit their phones while they're standing in the center of the ballroom. Julian nodded, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips. Consider the fuse lit. By tomorrow night, the Vance name will mean something very different in this city. 2 hours later, Elena stepped into the foyer of her parents' estate. The sound of a crystal glass shattering against the marble floor echoed from the living room, followed by a high-pitched, jagged shriek. Bianca was in the center of the room, her face flushed a blotchy, unattractive red. "What do you mean it's gone?" she screamed into her phone, her voice cracking with entitlement. "I saw the dress. It was on the floor. I am Bianca Vance. You can't just tell me there's a clerical error with my account." Arthur and Margaret Vance stood by the fireplace, looking like two deer caught in high beams. Margaret rushed forward, her hands fluttering as she tried to rub Bianca's shoulders. "Calm down, sweetheart. I'm sure your father can just call the owner of the boutique. It's probably just a misunderstanding with the bank." Elena watched from the shadows of the hallway, the irony of the situation warming her like a hidden fire. Bianca turned, her eyes landing on Elena's simple, unbranded trench coat. The girl's face twisted into a mask of pure venom. "You," she spat, pointing a manicured finger. "Did you do this? Did you go back to that shop and say something? You're so pathetic, trying to ruin my big night because you have nothing. You're just a bitter, talentless shadow." Elena didn't flinch. She walked past the chaos toward the sideboard, picking up a small, silver-framed photo of her grandmother, the only thing in this house she still cared to claim. "I'm just here for a few personal items, Bianca," she said, her voice like silk over stone. She turned to face her sister, her gaze level and unnervingly calm. "But if I were you, I'd worry less about a dress and more about the ground you're standing on." Sometimes, when you build a life on a foundation of stolen sand, the tide comes in much faster than you expect. Bianca let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Steal a life? You're delusional. You're a charity case, Elena. We let you stay here out of pity. Tomorrow, at the gala, everyone is going to see exactly who the real star of this family is." Arthur stepped forward, his brow furrowed in that familiar look of disappointment he always reserved for his eldest daughter. "Elena, really, don't upset your sister. She's under an immense amount of pressure representing our family's interests tomorrow. If you can't be supportive, perhaps you shouldn't come at all." In the corner of the room, Marcus Stone leaned against the doorframe, a glass of scotch in his hand. He hadn't joined in the shouting. Instead, he watched Elena. He noticed the way her hands didn't shake, the way she didn't look down at her shoes like she used to. He'd spent years helping Bianca spend Elena's money, but for the first time, a cold shiver of doubt traced its way down his spine. Elena caught his eye and gave a microscopic, knowing nod. She knew exactly what he was, a scavenger, and scavengers were always the first to flee a sinking ship. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn, Elena returned to her quiet apartment. She laid out her outfit for the next evening, not the modest rags her parents expected, but a gown of midnight silk that whispered of power and secrets. She checked her watch. 24 hours. She picked up her phone and sent a final text to Julian. Proceed. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart. Tomorrow, the Vance name wouldn't be a shield for her sister's lies anymore. It would be a cage. All that was left was the weight, and for the first time in her life, the silence felt like a victory. The evening of the Vance legacy, Gala arrived with a stifling scent of lilies and the sharp, rhythmic clinking of crystal against crystal. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a cavern of gold leaf and velvet, a space designed specifically to make the wealthy feel important and the uninvited feel small. Elena Vance stood near a fluted marble pillar, her midnight blue gown catching the light in a way that made her look less like a guest and more like a shadow waiting for the sun to set. The silk was heavy, a cool weight against her skin that felt like armor. She watched as her family moved through the crowd. They were in their element, basking in the reflected glow of a lie they had spent years polishing. Bianca Vance was at the center of a semicircle of admirers, her laughter ringing out like a series of practiced notes. She was draped in a gown of shimmering champagne lace, a piece that Elena knew had cost $40,000, money drawn from an account Bianca thought was her own personal inheritance, but was actually a slush fund Elena had used to track her sister's fraudulent spending. "You're standing in the dark again, Elena." She didn't need to turn to recognize her mother's voice. Margaret Vance stepped into view, her diamonds catching the chandelier light with every shallow breath. She adjusted the strap of Elena's dress with a sharp, dismissive tug. "Try to look at least a little happy. This is a big night for your sister. The foundation is naming her Visionary of the Year. It would be nice if you could pretend to be proud for once, instead of looking like a Victorian orphan." "I'm exactly as happy as I should be, Mother," Elena replied, her voice a calm, level contrast to the frantic energy of the room. Arthur Vance joined them, checking his gold watch with a frown. "Where is Sylvia? She's supposed to be hosting the head table. And for heaven's sake, Elena, move away from the pillar. You're blocking the path for the caterers. Go find a seat in the back rows before the speeches start." He didn't wait for an answer, turning instead to greet a passing senator with a jovial shout. Elena watched them walk away, her father's hand resting proudly on Bianca's shoulder as they moved toward the stage. The dismissal was familiar, a dull ache she had long ago learned to sharpen into a weapon. A soft vibration hummed against her thigh. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. A single message from Julian Thorne sat on the screen. "The server link is live. Aunt Sylvia has the primary remote. We are 5 minutes from the presentation." Elena looked up and caught Julian's eye across the room. He was standing near the tech booth, looking every bit the high-powered attorney in a charcoal suit. He gave a microscopic nod and turned back to his conversation. The trap was no longer being built. It was merely waiting for the prey to step onto the trigger. "Is it done?" Elena startled slightly as Aunt Sylvia appeared beside her. The older woman looked regal in deep emerald, her expression unreadable behind a mask of perfect social poise. "It's done," Elena whispered. "The bank records, the identity theft filings, and the metadata from the influencer contracts she forged. It's all in the slide deck." Sylvia squeezed Elena's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "They've spent your entire life telling you that you were the secondary character in their story, Elena. Tonight, we remind them who actually wrote the book." As Sylvia moved toward the podium to begin her duties as the gala chair, Bianca and Marcus Stone drifted over. Marcus looked pale, his eyes darting toward the exits as if he could sense the atmospheric pressure dropping. Bianca, however, was radiant with unearned confidence. She leaned in, the smell of her expensive, cloying perfume filling Elena's space. "Did you see the program, Elena?" Bianca smirked, flicking a stray thread off Elena's shoulder with a manicured nail. "My speech is right before the main auction. I'm announcing the new Vance Tech Scholarship. It's a shame you never had the brains for the family business, but don't worry. I'll make sure the foundation sends you a little something every month so you don't have to live in that depressing apartment anymore." "That's very generous of you, Bianca," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the large projection screen behind the podium. "I think everyone in this room is going to be very surprised by what you've been doing with the family's resources." Bianca laughed, a sharp, entitled sound. "Oh, I'm sure they will be. Success looks good on me, doesn't it? Come on, Marcus. The photographer wants a shot of the visionary before the lights go down." She swept away, trailing silk and arrogance. Elena watched her go, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The rage was there, but it was cold now, a frozen lake beneath a thin sheet of ice. The house lights dimmed. A hush fell over the 300 guests as the Vance family took their seats in the front row, bathed in the soft blue glow of the stage lights. Arthur and Margaret sat on either side of Bianca, their faces beaming with the reflected glory of their favorite daughter. Aunt Sylvia stepped up to the microphone, her voice amplified and clear. "Welcome, everyone, to the Vance Legacy Gala. Tonight, we celebrate achievement, integrity, and the future of our family's name." Elena felt her pulse steady. She reached into her clutch one last time, her fingers brushing the smooth, cold surface of the obsidian phone. She didn't look at the stage. She looked at her sister's profile, the tilted chin, the smug smile, the absolute certainty that she was untouchable. Before we begin the awards, Sylvia continued, her gaze flickering toward the tech booth where Julian stood ready, we have a special presentation prepared by the Vance estate, a true look behind the curtain at the work that has been done this year. The screen behind her flickered to life. The first slide wasn't the expected montage of Bianca's filtered Instagram photos or charity galas. It was a black screen with a single line of text in stark white font, the price of a lady, a record of unauthorized transactions. The room went silent. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a car crash. Elena leaned back against the marble pillar, her breath hitching in her chest. The countdown had ended. The wait was over. Bianca leaned forward, her brow furrowed in confusion, her hand reaching out to clutch Marcus's arm. But Marcus was already pulling away, his chair scraping loudly against the parquet floor as he realized the screen was showing a scanned copy of his own signature on a fraudulent loan application. Elena watched the color begin to drain from her father's neck. She didn't move. She didn't smile. She simply waited for the next slide to drop. Seconds stretched into an agonizing minute as the silence in Aunt Sylvia's ballroom deepened, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sudden, sharp ozone of the projector's cooling fan. Elena Vance didn't move. She stood near the marble pillar, her posture a stark contrast to the crumbling figures at the center of the room. She watched as the next slide flickered onto the massive screen, replacing the fraudulent loan with a detailed ledger of unauthorized wire transfers. Bianca Vance let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She looked toward her parents, her hands trembling so violently that the champagne in her glass sloshed over the rim, staining her designer sleeve. "This is a mistake," she hissed, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "It's a hack. Elena, tell them you did this. Tell them you're jealous." Arthur and Margaret Vance stood frozen, their faces masks of mounting horror. Arthur choked on a sip of vintage red, the liquid staining his lips like a bruise, while Margaret's hand flew to the heavy diamond necklace at her throat, her fingers twisting the stones as if they could anchor her to the reality she'd spent years polishing. "Jealousy requires a desire for what you have, Bianca," Elena said, her voice cutting through the room with the precision of a scalpel. She stepped out from the shadows of the pillar, the light catching the sharp lines of her face. "But I've spent the last 4 years realizing that everything you have actually belongs to me." The screen shifted again. It wasn't just bank statements now. It was a corporate filing for Vance Global Tech, a firm the industry had been whispering about for 18 months. The founder's name wasn't a mystery anymore. It was there in bold, black letters, Elena Vance, CEO and majority shareholder. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Aunt Sylvia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she compared the brilliant, cold woman standing before her to the disappointing niece her sister had complained about for a decade. Marcus Stone, who had been Bianca's most vocal defender, took a deliberate step back, his hand dropping from her waist as if she'd suddenly become radioactive. Bianca's face didn't just pale. It turned a sickly, translucent gray, the color of wet ash. Her carefully contoured features seemed to melt as her jaw slackened, her mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O. The confidence that usually radiated from her eyes vanished, replaced by a frantic, darting terror that made her look like a trapped animal. Her nostrils flared with every shallow, hitching breath, and a single bead of sweat broke from her hairline, carving a jagged path through her expensive foundation. The muscles in her neck spasmed, her throat working as she tried to swallow a truth that was already choking her. She looked smaller, older, and utterly stripped of the artifice that had been her only currency. "You stole my social security number to float your lifestyle," Elena continued, her tone conversational, almost bored. "You used my credit to buy that car outside. You even forged my signature on the lease for this very event. You thought I was too quiet to notice. You thought I was too weak to care." "Elena, please," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. "Not here, not in front of everyone." "Why not here, Mother?" Elena asked, turning her gaze toward the woman who had spent years telling her to be more like her sister. You always said Bianca was the star of the family. I thought you'd want to see her final performance. Julian Thorne stepped out from the back of the room, a leather briefcase in hand. He didn't say a word. He simply handed a thick stack of legal documents to the uniformed security guards who had appeared at the ballroom entrance. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the guards' palms was like a gavel. "The police are waiting in the foyer, Bianca," Julian said, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that felt like a death knell. "The identity theft charges are already filed. The embezzlement suit for Vance Global Tech follows in the morning." Bianca reached out for Marcus, but he pivoted away, adjusting his cufflink and looking at the ceiling as if he'd never seen her before in his life. The socialites who had been laughing with her moments ago were now whispering behind their hands, their eyes bright with the predatory gleam of those watching a fall from grace. Elena walked toward her sister, stopping just inches away. The smell of Bianca's perfume, the one she'd charged to Elena's secret account, was cloying. "You called me a ghost in my own home for 20 years, Elena said, her voice a mere whisper that somehow carried to the back of the hall. "But ghosts see everything, and now the world finally sees you." Without waiting for a response, without looking back at the parents who were already trying to stammer out excuses to Aunt Sylvia, Elena turned on her heel. Her heels clicked a steady, victorious rhythm against the parquet floor. She didn't stay to watch the handcuffs. She didn't stay to hear the sobbing. She walked out of the ballroom and into the cool night air, Julian following a respectful pace behind her. She had given them exactly what they wanted, a night they would never forget. Minutes after Elena stepped into the cool night air, the ballroom behind her erupted into a discordant symphony of panic. The silence that had greeted her revelation shattered, replaced by the frantic murmurs of 300 people who had just witnessed a social execution. Inside the hall, the air was heavy with the cloying scent of lilies and the metallic tang of ozone from the projector that still hummed, casting the damning evidence of identity theft across the far wall in stark, unblinking light. Bianca stood in the center of the parquet floor, a circle of empty space widening around her as if she had suddenly become contagious. Her face was a study in structural collapse. The vibrant, polished influencer persona she'd spent years cultivating didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Her eyes, usually wide and performatively bright for the lens of a smartphone, were now bloodshot and darting like a trapped animal's. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, grayish pallor that made her expensive foundation look like a mask of drying clay. Her mouth worked soundlessly, her lower lip trembling with a violence that made her chin dimple. Every few seconds, a sharp, ragged breath hitched in her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as she realized the cameras in the room, the ones she had invited to document her triumph, were now capturing her annihilation. "It's a lie," she finally shrieked, the sound tearing through the room. She turned toward the nearest table, her hands clawing at the air. "Elena is a tech genius. She probably faked the whole thing. She's always been jealous of me. Marcus, tell them she's lying." Marcus Stone didn't move toward her. Instead, he took a deliberate step backward, his polished loafers clicking against the wood. He wiped his palms on his trousers as if her very presence had left a film of filth on his skin. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice loud enough for the surrounding board members to hear. He wasn't looking at the woman he'd claimed to love. He was looking at the CFO of Vance Tech, his face a mask of frantic self-preservation. "I had no idea she was diverting funds. I was just as much a victim as anyone else." The betrayal was a physical blow. Bianca staggered, her heels skidding. She turned toward her parents, her eyes wide and pleading. Arthur and Margaret Vance stood frozen, their faces pale. They didn't move to comfort their favorite daughter. Instead, Arthur stepped toward Aunt Sylvia, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sylvia, please," Arthur began, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man watching his retirement fund vanish. "We can fix this. Elena is she's always been emotional. We're family. We can handle this quietly without the lawyers." Sylvia didn't even grant him the courtesy of eye contact. She signaled to the waitstaff to stop the champagne service, her movements sharp and final. "Family protects its own, Arthur. You didn't protect Elena. You farmed her for 20 years, and now the harvest is over. She turned her back on them, her silk gown rustling with a sound like a closing door. At the edge of the room, Julian Thorne stepped back inside. He had paused at the mahogany double doors just long enough to ensure Elena was safely in the car, but he had one final task to complete. He moved through the crowd with the chillingly methodical precision of a predator. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Bianca. "As of 10 minutes ago," Julian said, his voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a scalpel, "the preliminary injunction has been served. Your personal accounts, which were fueled entirely by funds diverted from the ghost R&D budget Elena built, have been frozen. You'll find that your credit cards won't work for so much as a cab ride home." Bianca gasped, her hand flying to the diamond necklace that Elena's money had bought. "You can't do this. I'm the face of this family." "The Tribeca apartment? The lease is in Elena's name," Julian continued, ignoring her outburst. He pulled a blue folder from his jacket, the official seal catching the light. "You have until midnight to remove your personal effects. After that, anything left on the premises will be liquidated to begin the process of restitution. Security is already on site to change the locks." The room went silent again as the weight of the words sank in. It wasn't just a scandal, it was an eviction. It was the total stripping of the borrowed finery that had defined Bianca's existence. "Restitution," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "What about us?" Julian turned his cold, gray eyes toward the parents. "The forensic audit will determine the extent of your involvement in the misappropriation of Elena's intellectual property. Until then, I suggest you find a very good defense attorney. You're going to need one." He didn't stay to hear their excuses. He didn't stay to watch Bianca collapse onto the floor, her designer dress pooling around her like a shroud. He turned on his heel and walked out, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the hall. Outside, the night was still. Elena sat in the back of the black sedan, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look back at the mansion. She didn't need to. She could still feel the weight of the secret she'd carried for 2 decades, but for the first time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a foundation. Julian slid into the seat beside her, the car pulling away from the curb with a smooth, silent grace. "It's done," he said softly. "The accounts are locked. The locks are being changed." They have nothing left. Elena watched the lights of her parents' estate fade in the rearview mirror. She felt a strange, hollow peace, the kind that only comes after a long-awaited storm. She had given them exactly what they had always wanted. The world was finally watching. "Good," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Now, let's go build something that actually belongs to me." 6 months later, the view from the 42nd floor offered a clarity that the heavy velvet curtains of the Vance estate never could. Elena Vance stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of her new headquarters, watching the rain-slicked streets of the city pulse with life far below. The air in the office smelled of expensive espresso, and the faint, ozone-sharp scent of high-end server racks humming in the next room. It was a clean smell. A new smell. The door behind her opened with a soft click. Julian Thorne stepped inside, his footsteps silent on the polished charcoal tile. He didn't speak immediately, allowing her a moment of quiet as she watched a streak of lightning illuminate the skyline. He placed a leather-bound folder on her desk, the sound of the heavy paper a satisfying thud in the minimalist space. "The final liquidation is complete," Julian said, his voice carrying that familiar, dry professional edge. "The mansion was sold at auction yesterday. A boutique hotel group picked it up. They plan to gut the interior, remove the stifling atmosphere, as their architect put it." Elena turned, her silk blouse catching the dim light. She felt a strange, distant ripple of emotion, but it wasn't grief. It was more like the relief of a fever finally breaking. And the family. Julian leaned back against the edge of the mahogany desk. "Arthur and Margaret Vance have settled into that 2-bedroom condo in the suburbs. It's a respectable neighborhood, but Margaret has already been blacklisted from the local country club. Apparently, word of the fraud traveled faster than their moving van. Arthur spends most of his days in the garden, though I'm told he doesn't speak to the neighbors." He paused, sliding a single glossy photograph across the desk. It was a grainy paparazzi shot from a local tabloid. "And then there's the sister." Elena picked up the photo. Bianca Vance was unrecognizable. Gone were the designer labels and the entourage of sycophants. She was captured standing outside a mid-tier department store, wearing a polyester uniform vest and holding a plastic bin of hangers. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed by stylists she couldn't afford, was pulled back in a messy, utilitarian knot. The entitlement that used to radiate from her had been replaced by a hollow, frantic sort of exhaustion. "She tried to launch a redemption vlog last month," Julian added, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "It was taken down within hours. The comments section was unforgiving. Marcus Stone was the first to lead the charge. He's been very vocal about how deceived he was by her. He's already engaged to a textile heiress in Chicago." Elena set the photo down. The justice was proportional, a perfect mirror of the humiliation they had forced upon her for 2 decades. Bianca was finally living the life she had mocked Elena for, one of invisibility and manual labor. Her parents were living in the modest reality they had spent their lives trying to outrun. "Aunt Sylvia called this morning," Julian said, his tone softening. "She wanted to know if you were coming to the gala tonight. She's officially naming you the primary trustee of the family foundation." "I told her I'd think about it," Elena replied. She walked back to the window. The victory was absolute, but the cost sat in her chest like a cold stone. She had reclaimed her name, her fortune, and her dignity, but she had lost the illusion of a family. The bridge wasn't just burned. The very land it sat on had been salted. There would be no secret phone calls on birthdays, no whispered apologies in the middle of the night. She was the queen of a vast, glittering empire, and she was entirely alone in it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver key, the only thing she had taken from the mansion. It was the key to the attic room where she used to hide and code while Bianca threw parties downstairs. She felt the jagged edges of the metal against her thumb, a reminder of the girl who had survived on nothing but spite and brilliance. "Is it enough?" Julian asked quietly. Elena watched her own reflection in the glass, superimposed over the lights of the city she now partially owned. She saw a woman who no longer had to hide, a woman whose worth was no longer up for debate. She thought of Bianca's tired eyes in the photograph and Margaret's empty social calendar. "It's exactly what they earned," Elena said, her voice steady and devoid of regret. She walked to the shredder near her desk and dropped the photograph of her sister into the slot. The machine hummed, turning the image of Bianca's fall into meaningless white strips. Elena didn't stay to watch it finish. She picked up her coat, the heavy wool feeling like armor, and headed for the door. The world was waiting, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back to see who was following.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.